I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the Supreme Court's decision relating to the State Department's refusal to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of the State of Israel. You may know that the United States State Department policy, which is under the control of the executive branch, the White House, and the President, State Department policy is that Jerusalem is not the recognized capital of the State of Israel, but rather the status of Jerusalem remains an open issue of contention, which must be negotiated by Israel and the Palestinians as part of a larger peace agreement. That's why the United States Embassy in Israel remains in Tel Aviv and has never been moved to Jerusalem. It's also why the State Department insists that when any American citizen gives birth to a child in Jerusalem, that the place of birth on that child's passport may not read Israel, but must read Jerusalem. Normally, the country in which an American citizen is born is recorded as the place of birth of that child. But when it comes to an American child born in Jerusalem, since the State Department does not consider Jerusalem to be legally a part of Israel, the State Department refuses to put Israel on the child's passport, but rather simply puts Jerusalem. Now, this is the issue which motivated an American Jewish family, Ari and Naomi Zivotofsky, to go to court 12 years ago, suing the State Department for refusing to stamp the passport of their son Menachem with the place of Menachem's birth as Jerusalem. The case was argued before the Supreme Court of the United States, and the ruling came down in favor of the State Department and the executive's right to determine how it will formulate diplomatic policy. Now, the Supreme Court ruling has been roundly criticized by many in the Jewish community, and many are highly critical of the Obama administration for continuing a policy that refuses to recognize the reality that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Many in the Jewish community find it somewhat ludicrous that the president does not acknowledge that Jerusalem, certainly West Jerusalem, which everyone agrees is and will be the capital of Israel, regardless of any compromise that might be made with East Jerusalem. But certainly many argue the President of the United States could recognize West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And so there's disappointment, even anger, at the Supreme Court and at the President of the United States. But we should all be clear about the issue that was before the Supreme Court and upon which it ruled. The Supreme Court was not being asked to pass judgment on anything having to do with Jerusalem, though obviously Jerusalem was a key component to this lawsuit. But the issue at hand before the Supreme Court was a constitutional issue dealing with the separation of powers between the executive and the legislature. And in a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that the United States Congress, the legislature, does not have the right to impose its will upon the executive, the office of the president, when it comes to certain matters of foreign policy, including matters of diplomatic recognition. So the Supreme Court did not rule on whether Jerusalem is or is not the capital of Israel. However, the Supreme Court ruling has caused a very contentious issue and a hurtful piece of U.S. foreign policy. It has raised it into the public eye. The U.S. refusal to recognize any part of Jerusalem as the capital of the State of Israel. And we should all remember, this is not an Obama issue alone. Every single American president has joined in this refusal to recognize Jerusalem, Republican as well as Democrat. In fact, in 2002, President George W. Bush signed into law a provision urging the president to take steps to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and to have the passports of Americans born in Jerusalem record their place of birth as Israel. But after signing that bill into legislation, President Bush then refused to implement it, and did, even though he signed it. No president has agreed to recognize any part of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Rather, every president has taken the position that after the 1948 War of Independence, the status of Jerusalem remains an open question to be resolved by the parties. Till then, no one, according to the American State Department, has sovereignty over Jerusalem. Well, for some Israeli reaction to this hot-button issue, I'm so pleased to be joined on our JBS phones from Israel by an expert in international law, Professor Avi Bell, a member of the Bar-Ilan Faculty of Law and a senior fellow at the Kohelet Policy Forum. And Avi Bell received a great deal of positive publicity after he debated Richard Goldstone at the Stanford Law School, after which Justice Goldstein publicly acknowledged that, contrary to statements in his 2009 Goldstone report, Israel did not intentionally target civilians. And Avi, it's so wonderful to have you joining us. Thank you for giving us some time.
Thank you for having me.
So, Avi, what does it mean to you that the United States refuses to take sides on the issue of whether Jerusalem is or is not the capital of the State of Israel?
I thought that was a very wonderful intro you had, but I actually think that you're being a little bit soft with the United States in this point. It's not only a question of whether Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, which it has been since shortly after Israel's War of Independence, and the United States has never recognized. It's a question of whether Jerusalem is even a part of Israel at all. And the case that was before the Supreme Court had nothing to do with whether Jerusalem was the capital.
Yes.
What it had to do with was whether the State Department practice of denying that Jerusalem is in Israel in any part. Now, that policy, as you said, has been the policy of presidents of the United States since Truman, and it's an incoherent policy. As you said, it's currently justified by the idea that the status of Jerusalem has to be resolved in negotiations between Israel and the PLO, which began in 1993. But of course, the United States was not recognizing Israeli sovereignty over any part of Jerusalem long before negotiations between Israel and the PLO. In fact, long before the PLO even existed, and certainly long before the PLO ever thought of formulating a claim on any part of Jerusalem.
So
go ahead. I'm sorry.
When you see this decision come down and then you realize, again, as you said, the Supreme Court didn't rule on the question of Jerusalem, but the decision permits a United States policy to stay in place. Does it matter?
Correct.
Avi, practically speaking, for Israel, does it matter? And if it does, explain to us how.
Well, I don't think that anything that the State Department does or doesn't do as far as recognizing Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem is going to change the situation on the ground. Israel has had sovereignty over at least part of Jerusalem since the War of Independence, and it's impossible to foresee circumstances in which Israel will lose all of its sovereignty over all of Jerusalem. The only circumstance in which I can imagine Israel giving up sovereignty in any part would be through peace negotiations, which Israel agreed to. Now, if the question is what's the impact of this policy, I think that it makes it much more likely that peace negotiations will never be successful. Mm-hmm. It encourages, I think, intransigence on the Palestinian side. What the American policy is here is more or less something like this. It is forbidden for Israel to assert sovereignty over any area that's in dispute, well, it's not a problem at all for the Palestinians to assert sovereignty over an area which is not in dispute.
Yes.
The United States claims that the current areas in dispute are the areas that were occupied by Jordan between Israel's War of Independence in 1967. That is what people call the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem, at least part of Jerusalem, was never occupied by Jordan. It's not supposed to be, at least according to the way the United States presents the conflict, it's not supposed to be part of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. It's supposed to be acknowledged by all as Israeli. But the United States, for its own reasons, and again, this has nothing to do with the Palestinians, for its own reasons has never recognized Israeli sovereignty over any part of Jerusalem. And the reasons, the excuses that the U.S. government has given for this have changed over the decades. Now, when you see that sort of intransigence in the United States' part towards Israeli rights, it's very hard to see why the Palestinians should be more compromising than the U.S. is.
I understand. You know, we saw the Palestinians celebrating the Supreme Court decision. One of the things that I think concerns many American Jews is that this decision, which again only highlights an existing U.S. policy that's been in place since 1948, as well as since 1993, but that because it reinforces the notion that somehow America is not on Israel's side, it seems to bolster Palestinian hardline thinking and a reluctance to make any compromise. And I'm wondering whether, from an Israeli perspective, this bothers you.
It bothers me greatly. I think it's not a productive attitude to have a more hardline attitude towards Israel than even the PLO has. And frankly, the PLO has taken a very hardline attitude altogether in recent years, besides turning down repeated peace offers from Israel over the last 15 years. Throughout the last 6 or so years, the PLO under Mahmoud Abbas has gradually stiffened its position to the point where it says it will never compromise over anything that's in dispute, over none of the territory, over the rights of Palestinians to integrate into Israel, etc. And so when you have this uncompromising line, it really is devastating that the United States, instead of working to soften that Palestinian intransigence, is actually working to harden it.
Yes. Avi, I appreciate a few moments with you, and we will turn to you often when there are issues of this nature. It is a complicated issue, and again, I appreciate your spending a few moments with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
You be well.
Talking to you.
Thank you. Professor Avi Bell, a member of the Bar-Ilan Law School and a senior fellow at the Kohelet Policy Forum. We also wanted some American Jewish analysis of this issue, and so I'm very pleased to have on our JBS phones now Marc Stern, General Counsel for the American Jewish Committee. Marc, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Marc, what was your sense? Again, we tried to explain to the audience. The Supreme Court made no decision about Jerusalem. It was deciding whether ultimately there was a separation of powers issue as it applies to foreign policy and how the State Department and the executive do or do not recognize certain foreign entities. But at the same time, Marc, it has once again thrown into the public arena the fact that the United States refuses to recognize the capital of Israel as Jerusalem, that the State Department and the White House has taken this position president after president after president. It's both Democratic and Republican presidents have taken this position. But now, once again, here it is in the forefront of Jewish thinking. And Marc, I've spoken to many American Jews who are very upset that they're upset with the Supreme Court decision, but really I think the Supreme Court decided properly. But the underlying issue that everybody's upset with is, why isn't the Obama administration finding a way to recognize at least West Jerusalem as the sovereign capital of the sovereign state of Israel. I want your sense of that issue. How upset are you that traditionally the State Department and U.S. policy does not recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel?
You know, look, everybody thinks that it's been indefensible for many, many years, going back before I was born, actually, that Israel's capital is not formally recognized as such by the United States. That's been a troublesome fact for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
It also should be noted that at least in the last 3-4 decades, that's a notational problem. It's a problem of what the government says. When government officials go to Israel to meet with Israeli government officials, they no longer, as I think they once did, go to Tel Aviv. They meet them in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, when the president addressed, when foreign leaders come to Jerusalem, to Israel, they address the Knesset in Jerusalem. So it's true that it's irritating that they don't formally recognize Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, but practically, of course, they go to Jerusalem and meet with government officials there. They don't insist. Most of the government officials have offices in Tel Aviv. They don't do that, as they once did, insist on going to Tel Aviv. So it's important to keep this in some sense of proportion. It's troublesome. Every nation should be able to pick its own capital, and it's irritating, put it mildly, that it's not true in Israel. But in fact, de facto, everybody recognizes
but for you,
Jerusalem
Marc,
as its capital. But let me finish. I'm not sure that it's in the Jewish community, which is basically supported, at least as the governing presumption that Jerusalem will remain united. I'm not sure it would be an advantage to Israel to have the United States say, well, we recognize West Jerusalem as Israel, and East Jerusalem is what?
Jerusalem would remain
Palestinian?
No, it would be disputed as it is now.
I'm not sure I'm not sure how much of a help that would be.
You may be right. What you're saying is you'd rather see the United States recognize Jerusalem, period, rather than just West Jerusalem.
As long as the position of the Israeli government and most Jews, I would think, is that Jerusalem should never again be divided. I'm not sure I want the government of the United States dividing it unilaterally.
Very interesting. I hope people who have said to me, gee, why doesn't Obama at least recognize West Jerusalem, understands it's a little bit more
But
complicated.
they should ask where Obama went to meet with government officials.
Well, he went to Jerusalem.
So de facto they are recognizing.
Yes, but you seem to think it's a very small problem then. It has less to do with substance and more to do with symbolism. The problem I have with it is it's a function of a larger U.S. position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. On the one hand, the United States sort of claims to be neutral and wants to be a neutral mediator. At the same time, there are certain actions taken by sovereign states. Most American Jews now feel that it would be appropriate for the United States, even if it wants to be a broker of peace, to basically side with the reality of the situation, which is that Jerusalem is the capital, and that by not doing so, the United States is fueling a certain kind of Palestinian intransigence. Now that's the criticism. Marc, what do you say?
I think everybody has said from the beginning, again, we use words like everybody, but it has been understood from the beginning that Jerusalem is a highly sensitive issue. It has been so. It was so before 1967. It remains so. There will be negotiations eventually, one hopes, and the matter will be settled between the parties. I would be more upset if, as I think at one time was actually the case, American officials said, well, we're not going to Jerusalem to meet with you. You have to come to us in Tel Aviv. That would be truly upsetting.
Okay.
This is the maintenance of a long-standing position. Israel has thrived notwithstanding this position. It's built an extensive government complex in Jerusalem notwithstanding this position. It's irritating. It's wrong. But one shouldn't, one wishes that the administration and previous administrations would overcome it. But it's not the end of the world.
Of course, of course. Marc, what do you think is really behind it? If you were going to argue the administration's case in the best possible way, what is their argument as you understand it?
Okay, I'm not in the business usually of making arguments in public that run against Israeli.
But you'll do it for
visions.
me.
But I think I would say, first of all, the UN declaration that established the State of Israel recognized Jerusalem. I won't attempt the Latin, but as a separate city. Its status was never settled in international law. It has remained so all these years. We maintained that policy. We didn't recognize Jordanian control of East Jerusalem when they had de facto control. And the parties will ultimately have to reach an agreement on Jerusalem. We will respect that agreement. But until then, we are staying with the position that we have enunciated since the founding of the state, and which was one of the principles on which the UN recognized the State of Israel.
That is true, Marc. The problem I have with that is the UN recognized all kinds of things in the 1947 partition plan. None of them exist anywhere on the western side of the Jordan River. The borders that now separate Israel from the West Bank, the Green Line as it's called, are not borders that were created by any juridical international agreement. They're not lines that were drawn by the United Nations.
You can't seriously be arguing that Israel wants to go back to what the partition allowed.
Yes, but my point is, if you argue that the reason why you shouldn't extend Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem is it wasn't part of the initial...
This is the government arguing, not Marc Stern.
Right, I'm not saying you're arguing, but if you're saying that the American government is arguing, we're not going to recognize the Israeli sovereignty of Jerusalem because it wasn't part of the partition plan.
And we didn't recognize Jordanian sovereignty.
But then it should be recognizing nothing.
So that's what they're doing.
No, they recognize all of Israel except Jerusalem. And on what grounds, one consistent grounds does the United States recognize parts of Israel which were never part of the partition plan?
I'm not sure which hat I'm wearing right this minute, but
well, right now you're just trying to explain to me what you think the logic is.
What I would say to you on behalf of the government is it's a unique city. 3 faiths, not just 2, have an interest in the city. There is no way that we can, if we were today to unilaterally declare all of Jerusalem, however that's defined, to be part of Israel, aside from the fact that it would send the Palestinians permanently out of peace negotiations, it wouldn't solve anything because the Palestinians will still make that demand. It accomplishes, they would argue, it would accomplish nothing. De facto, you have control.
Okay, and now I'm asking you now with a Jewish hat on, AJC hat, do you buy that argument?
I don't buy it. I don't accept it. But I hear it. I understand what it is, and it has been so for 67 years now, and so it's an irritant in an otherwise good and sound and indispensable relationship, and it ought to be kept in proportion.
Okay. There are some people who claim that the bottom line here is that for generations the State Department has been anti-Semitic. So
anti-what?
Semitic. That there's an anti-Israel bias in the State Department because there are anti-Semites in the State Department.
Look, there were at one time undeniably anti-Semites in the State Department. It's a very long time ago.
You do not believe, by the way, that is any, that is no longer
The State Department
issue.
is a big organization. Is there anybody in the State Department who's anti-Semitic?
No.
How would I know?
Of course, that's not what we mean. Do you feel that the policy generated by the State Department is a product of anti-Semitism?
The products generated by the State Department are generated in responsibility of the President and the Secretary of State. And by and large, as is generally acknowledged, the United States has been the indispensable friend of Israel. In 1967, in 1973, in Gaza, and the Prime Minister acknowledged it in his address to Congress. I heard Yuval Steinitz the other day at our global forum say you have no idea the defense and the security cooperation is very close. If from time to time there are policies that we don't like, we are free to seek to have them change. We can attempt to persuade, but it's simply a distortion of reality to reduce them to anti-Semitism.
I understand. I appreciate that perspective, and I hope our audience hears it. Marc, as always, I enjoy speaking with you. I hope I get to see you soon. We will turn to you often, my friend.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Marc Stern, General Counsel for the American Jewish Committee. And basically, you heard both an Israeli and an American Jew, say that the issue shouldn't be upsetting American Jews as much as it is, and that it is less of an issue than many people are making of it. At the same time, the fact that the United States has refused to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of the sovereign state of Israel just feels wrong, doesn't it? The Supreme Court ruling on separation of powers, that seems to be correct. But it's raised to the fore the fact that the United States State Department is maintaining what seems to be an antiquated policy, injurious to the state of Israel, and which does, in my opinion, nothing to further the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. I appreciate the United States trying to be a mediator between the state of Israel and the Palestinians. But I feel it should be an honest mediator, and that it's time for the President of the United States and for the State Department to be loud and clear in its commitment to the legitimacy of the Jewish state of Israel, and that the United States can only be supportive of Palestinian rights and Palestinian needs if and when the Palestinians publicly and in Arabic embrace the concept of sharing the land with the Jewish state of Israel. And part of U.S. honesty should be a U.S. recognition that Jerusalem is the capital of the sovereign state of Israel. My thanks to Serge Goldberg, our production coordinator and director of this edition of In the News. Thanks also to Corey Sivikoff and to Dennis Golan. And my thanks to our producers for this edition of In the News, Ron Jacobsohn and Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.